Hello, and welcome to the Kings Weekly podcast, part of the Basketball Intelligence Network, the Believe Network, and the Old Man Squad Network. I am your co-host, Nick Agar Johnson, editor-in-chief and staff writer for No Ceilings NBA, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, the founder and curator of the Basketball Intelligence newsletter, available at basketballintelligence.net, Ray LeBeau. Hello there, Ray.
Hello, Nick. Hello, everyone.
So we have a little bit of Kings news to get through. And then we have a couple fun exercises towards the end, including our now somewhat established traditional wrap up of song titles for the Kings. But the big piece of news in Kingsland obviously concerns the draft lottery. So we'll get into that. Also, later on, we will talk about, for those of you who are became fans of certain players who used to play for the Kings, those players are now flourishing elsewhere in the playoffs. And so we wanted to just, talk purely for fun about some of the old Kings fan favorites who are making hay in the NBA postseason.
Great. Look forward to it.
So we'll be getting to that in a bit. But first of all, just to talk about the big news, which is the lottery coin flip that the Kings lost to the Utah Jazz, which means that the Kings will enter the NBA draft lottery in early May with the fifth best odds. So just to give sort of a very basic rundown, and then we'll talk about some of the players that the Kings might take in those spots, sort of rehashing some of the ones from the mock draft exercise we did a couple months ago and adding in a few new names that might be on the list. But just to give the overview of what the lottery odds are at this point. So with the Kings being in the fifth spot, oddly enough, because of how the lottery odds work, that is actually the second least likely pick that the Kings will end up with on draft night. So because the lottery is for the top four slots, the Kings have a 44.1% chance of jumping into the top four. So that being the combined odds of number one pick, which they have 11.5% odds, number two pick, 11.4%, number three pick, 11.2%, and number four, 11.1%. So that is what we're looking at in terms of a 44% chance of jumping, 45.1. Yeah, 45.1%. I did the math correctly the second time around.
What would be Utah's percentage likelihood of staying in the top four?
So their odds of staying in the top four are exactly the same as the Kings, but the difference is that because Utah starts at the fourth position, they can only slide back so far. And therefore, their odds of being the fifth pick are actually much higher than the Kings, because that means that one team jumps the Jazz into the top four. But because the Jazz and the Kings are, because the Jazz are at the fourth spot, really all that does is control how far they fall. But the odds of getting a top four pick are essentially identical.
Okay.
So from the Kings' perspective, again, 11.5 number one, 11.4 number two, 11.2 number three, 11.0 for the fourth pick. Then again, because of the way the draft lottery works, the Kings only end up at number 5 precisely if the lottery is chalk. If Washington, Indiana, Brooklyn, and Utah are the top 4 picks in some order, that's the only way the Kings end up at 5. And the odds of a chalk lottery are 2%. So those are the odds that the Kings are the 5th pick. But the most likely slot for the Kings to end up at this point is actually the 7th pick, followed by the 6th pick, followed by all 4 lottery slots. Then we get into the more unlikely is the 8th pick at 8.5%, then the 5th pick at 2%. And, this is the one that's been brought up around Kingsland, is technically now it is possible for the Kings to fall to the number 9 overall pick. The odds of that happening are very, 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 very small. It means that every team with lower lottery odds outside of the top 5 has to jump into the lottery, and none of the teams in the top 4, as well as the Kings at 5, get into any of the lottery slots. So again, the doomerism is certainly fair, given that we're talking about the Sacramento Kings here, and the fact that they lost the coin flip doesn't really help the doomerism discussion at all. But just to give a basic overview, odds are better that the Kings end up in the lottery than that they end up at any pick outside the lottery. So it's 44%, 45% to be in the lottery. Their most likely pick is the 7th pick at 25.5%. So, the combined odds of them being 5, 6, 7 are pretty much the same, slightly higher, but pretty much the same as their odds of being in the top 4. And
So
then,
let me ask you a question.
oh, yeah.
How much money do you think you would have to offer somebody to take your proposal of, I'll give you X if you can spend the next, I don't know, whatever number of time coming up with a lottery system that's more dysfunctionally convoluted than the current one?
I mean, depending on the amount of money I'm getting, I could definitely come up with something more convoluted, but it would take work.
Dysfunctionally convoluted.
Yeah, no, it would take work, but we could get there. I mean, I think it can be now I'm going to get into video game terminology, but there's the notion that a certain speed running record for a game was set because a ridiculously tiny odds chance of I think it was a gamma wave flipping a bit on the video game console that made it possible for someone to, hack their way through one level in record time, to the point where, it was thought for many years there's no way that they could have gotten it without cheating. But it turns out it was like a 1 in a quintillion % odds of the bit flipping the way it did. I think there's a 1 in a quintillion chance.
I'm going to add one qualification to this. You have to come up with it yourself. It can't be machine generated.
That's fair. I mean, yeah, no, what I was trying to get at with that is, even if something seems statistically impossible, there is such, potential for random chance in the universe that it is possible to design a more dysfunctionally convoluted system.
Okay.
Not sure I'd bet on it, but
it's got to be one that has a realistic possibility of a 1.8 chance getting Cooper flag. It's got to be more dysfunctional than that.
Well, yeah.
Anyway,
and,
I just the question. Okay.
Well, no, we can get back into the fact that if the Kings had won the play-in game, then they would also have Cooper flag. But that's a depressing discussion for another time. But yes, for all the weirdness and math that I laid out and mostly got right and a couple times got wrong and corrected myself, the long and the short of it is that the odds are, there's a greater than 90% chance that the Kings end up drafting somewhere in the 1 through 7 range.
Okay.
With the most likely individual slot being the 7th pick, but their odds of jumping into the lottery being higher than their odds of being the 7th pick.
Yeah, my only thought was basically, look, we created the draft for a particular purpose. We've now completely lost sight of that purpose, or very close to it. Why have we bothered doing all these things that are so convoluted, they're hard to follow, and they rarely yield that result? We don't need to go into all that now. It's for another show, but that was basically why I was asking that.
And I think the best answer I can come up with for that is, sometimes sports leagues are incredibly staunch and rooted in their ways, and other times they make changes, and sometimes those are changes that are necessary and positive, and sometimes there are changes that are made so that whoever the consultant was that proposed the change can say, see, look, they took my idea, or, hey, we changed something. Don't blame us for it not working. Look, we've made all these changes.
Okay, I diverted you from your path, but go ahead.
So with that in mind, just sort of circling back and talking about some of the players that are likely to be on the board for the Kings, wherever they end up. And, in our last mock draft exercise, we talked through the top 4 players in this draft who it would be the biggest surprise of my NBA draft coverage career if anybody goes in the top 4 that is not H.A. Debonta, Darren Peterson, Cam Boozer, and Caleb Wilson. It's like, again, maybe there's, some medical stuff that I don't know and somebody drops because of that. Maybe, despite everything I know about those four gentlemen, for whatever reason, somebody just absolutely bombs every draft. And like, I don't, again, talking about the bit flipping thing, there's a ridiculously tiny odds chance of something weird happening, in all of these contexts. And that's just how it is. But again, I would be shocked if anybody outside of those four names hears their names called in the top four of the draft. So, given that that's the good outcome for the Kings, is they jump somewhere into that top four and pick one of those four guys, it is also worth, I think, talking about the flip side, because as we talked about when we did the mock draft exercise, and as has only solidified itself in the months since we did that, this is a truly special point guard class for a team that is in truly desperate need of a point guard. And so, again, doomerism aside, which there's plenty of reasonable and rampant doomerism in the Kings fandom, I am at a point with this draft class where even if the Kings fall to 9, they are going to have, honestly, in all likelihood, multiple really good point guard options on the table for them to choose from. And something that I was talking about pre-show with you is that as solidified as the top 4 is, the next 4 isn't anywhere near as like locked in, but there are certainly 4 names that, if you're talking about the 5th pick or the 6th pick, there are 4 names that tend to come up before any others. And honestly, one of them has dimmed a bit in the popular consensus, but he's also the guy I'm highest on, so I'm not going to factor that into the equation here. But the 4 guys being Darius Acuff Jr. out of Arkansas, Keaton Wagler out of Illinois, Mikal Brown Jr. out of Louisville, and then the guy that I have 5th on my personal board, Kingston Flemings of the University of Houston. And they're quite different as a group of guards, but all 4 of them would provide something absolutely necessary for the Kings. And I'm just going to start with Acuff because he's the one who there have been rumors linking him to Sacramento, and the idea that certainly he is popular. If anybody breaks into the top 4 that isn't the 4 names that I mentioned, it's almost certainly going to be Darius Acuff Jr. And he's always been incredibly gifted at putting the ball in the basket. But, with Acuff, the shooting was sort of the known thing going in, was that this guy is someone who's really honestly more the scoring than the shooting. There were certainly questions about him being efficient from long range. And then this past season, he blistered the nets, shot like 44% from distance, while also, my biggest concern about him heading into the year was, him creating shots for people other than himself. And he was so far ahead of my expectations on that front. He really had a special season for the Arkansas Razorbacks, and certainly was not his fault that they ended up falling in the tournament to, team that had a really good chance of going all the way in the Arizona Wildcats. But with Acuff, he instantly is the best shooter on the Kings by a pretty significant margin. And, we've talked about it multiple times, certainly most recently on our literal last episode of how the Kings were dead last in 3-point shooting and 3-point attempts. Darius Acuff will correct that pretty much immediately, as will Mikal Brown Jr., who honestly, the only reason I'm slightly lower on him than 6th, which is essentially the draft slot I'm talking about him at right now, and not that much lower, I have him 8th, but his injury concerns this year were back injuries, which is always a worrisome thing when we're talking about NBA players. You could go down the list. There is a very long storied list of players whose careers were just ruined by back problems. So obviously hoping that's not the case for multiple different reasons for Mikal Brown Jr., but he has a benefit over Acuff, which is just that he's 3 inches taller. And given that both of them have pretty serious defensive concerns, it's easier for me to buy in on Brown Jr. figuring that stuff out than Acuff Jr. just because, Mikal Brown has a few inches on him, which that helps in that front. There's also, I mean, a little bit more defensive willingness and effort on Mikal Brown Jr.'s end. It's one of those things where it's always difficult to evaluate when someone is that much of the offense in the way that Acuff was. I mean, he averaged 24 points and 6.5 assists per game. Like he was not going to have any energy left to expend on the defensive end anyway. And so I'm much more willing to buy into Mikal Brown Jr. as a long-term defender at the NBA level. But I mean, what Acuff did this past year at Arkansas was both spectacular and also purely in terms of the scoring stuff about slightly more than expected because he had a really great year. But that was sort of the idea going in, is this guy could just put the ball in the basket, and him doing the point guard stuff that he did this year was a huge feather in his cap. And so, the other two guards that are sort of talked about in this range, Keaton Wagler is a bit more of a pure sort of scoring guard rather than a point guard type, rather than someone who is going to make the kinds of next level reads that Acuff and Brown can make. Not to say that Wagler is a bad passer by any means, but if you're bringing him on board, you're bringing him in for the scoring. And, that's something that he went from 3-star recruit to top 10 pick in a year, which is not something you see very often. My biggest concern with Wagler is he is not a good athlete. He's not even a below average athlete. He will be he was 10th percentile in a number of measurements this past year. He was 6'6". He did not complete a single dunk on the year for Illinois. He is purely a below the rim player who, if he gets to the point where he is, a net neutral defensively, it will be due to positioning and really high basketball IQ, which the good news is that he has those things, but certainly if we're talking about physical traits, he is the least physically gifted of the three that I've mentioned so far. And then the guy who I have at 5th, who it feels like people have soured on / gotten a little bit colder on the outlook for Kingston Flemings in recent weeks. I think part of that is just because he doesn't quite generate his own offense in the same way that the other three guys do. But I think Kingston Flemings is a future all defensive team player. He's that special at the point of attack. I mean, it says quite a lot that playing for Kelvin Sampson and the Houston Cougars, he was the point guard one basically from day one and was trusted with the toughest defensive assignments and fulfilled those assignments incredibly successfully. Again, the volume from 3-point range is not as encouraging. He still shot 38%, right? And he had a 42-point game on the season. It's not like he can't explode in that sort of way offensively. And he's just done a different level defensively than the other guys. So even if, there's slightly less sort of self-generated offense than there is with the three names I mentioned previously, I'm sorry. I undersold it. He was actually a 39% 3-point shooter on the year. So again, I really, really believe in Kingston Flemings. And so maybe there would be some other people who think it's more of a 3 guards after the top 4 than 4. But I have Kingston Flemings at 5. So I have met of all of those guys. And it's because of the two-way impact that he can have in addition to being this point guard with great vision, having this incredible mid-range game, shot 85% from the free throw line as well. There's every reason to believe in him having very, very, very good, maybe not elite, but very good touch. So yeah, again, there's the very small chance that the Kings fall to 9, but it's extraordinarily unlikely, and odds are they're going to end up on draft night with one of the 4 guards that I just talked about. And those would be guys who would be top 3 contenders in most draft years. So the fact that this year's point guard class is so overloaded, it's wonderful for the NBA in general because there's going to be a whole crop of new fun guards entering the league. But for the Kings in particular, they are virtually guaranteed to either get one of the top 3 guys or get a truly special point guard.
So, as you know, I'm not very much of a comps guy, and I think it's mostly embarrassing to listen to people do it. Nonetheless, I'm going to ask you whether Flemings reminds you, not really to compare them in the sense that people do their comps, but is there any guard that's either point guard that's currently in the NBA or has been in the NBA relatively prominently in recent years that his style or any other aspect of his play kind of reminds you of?
Jrue Holiday.
Oh, I'll
One
take
of the
him.
easiest comps for me that there is.
Okay.
He's,
That's a great choice. Right.
yeah, I mean, he doesn't have like Jrue Holiday has like a 7-foot wingspan, something ridiculous like that. Kingston Flemings doesn't have ridiculous length to that degree, but the reason that I think Jrue Holiday is the comp here is special defensive player, reads the floor at an incredibly high level, isn't necessarily someone who's going to wow you with their scoring punch, but can absolutely be,
Had big games.
Has had big games, can continue to have big games. Maybe doesn't, maybe is sort of quote unquote undervalued in terms of the all-star discussion, but I fully believe that Kingston Flemings will contend for all defensive teams in his career. It's also just honestly the sort of completeness of the other areas of his game. Like he's this sort of mid-range master in a way that you only get to sort of bring that tool out of the toolkit if you're either the primary or secondary scorer for a team. But, it's the kind of thing where if you're given the option to attack and you have open space in front of you, it's not like Kingston Flemings is not going to be helpful once he's forced off the 3-point line. It's not, if he can't get all the way to the basket, he's not going to score. He has enough of that sort of in-between game, that juice in those other areas. I think Flemings is more of a quote-unquote pure point guard than Jrue Holiday, but the idea there is the same of maybe the scoring is actually the least impressive thing, and they're still more than good enough as a scorer to get you the buckets you need when you need them.
And would you say that one of the many things that Jrue is noted for is his high basketball IQ? Would you say that is consistent with Flemings?
100%. I mean, again, you don't need to take my word for it. All you can take the word of Kelvin Sampson, who, played this freshman point guard all the minutes that he played and in the role that he played and trusted him to fulfill that role. Yeah. I mean,
so that's a good thing that others have underrated him, because that makes him more likely to be available for the Kings should they fall.
Yeah. If the Kings fall to 8 and Kingston Flemings is the last of the 4 guards that I mentioned taken, he might be the best fit for the Kings. Granted, he doesn't solve the glaring 3-point shooting problem in the way that the other 3 do, but he's not a bad shooter. He's quite a good shooter. He's just not the same volume as those other guys.
When was the last draftee of anybody the perfect player? Just curious.
I mean, a couple of years ago, the San Antonio Spurs took this guy named Victor Wembanyama.
Okay. So that that overused word of generational, maybe it should be like multi-generational for him, but it's just not going to happen, right? So that's okay that he's not perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's the thing that has me. It's excited, but it's also sort of. I think the best way I can put this is anti-doomerism. I really think that in a more normal class, any one of those guys would be, maybe not the number 1 pick, but like I'm going to, sound immediately hypocritical because I really, really thought Dylan Harper was a special player. And so I wouldn't have any of these guys competing with him for number 2. But like any of these guys could have been number 3 in last year's draft class. And VJ Edgecombe had a pretty spectacular year for the Philadelphia 76ers. So I'm not saying that to bash anybody. Rather, I'm saying that to emphasize how strongly I believe in the point guards in this draft class. Again, these are players who are competing for being, way lower down the guard totem pole than they would be in a more normal draft.
And one of the things that, because of how little the Kings can actually fall, they're going to be in the almost unique position of being able to take the best player that's left also being the best fit that's left. That rarely happens.
Absolutely. And that sort of leads into the place where I wanted to wrap up the draft discussion, which is, okay, absolute worst case scenario. It's slightly great. It's like 1 in 167% chance. Somehow everything goes wrong. The Kings end up with the 9th pick. The guy that I have at 9th on my board is also a point guard. And the guy that I have 11th on my board is someone who I'm willing to bet there is at least someone in the audience who's screaming, how did you not mention him in the first 4 guards that you mentioned in Braden Burries, who having him at 11 makes me the low man on Braden Burries, but Paige and I talked about him on the Deep Dives podcast over on the No Ceilings NBA podcast feed, like in December. Like it's not like I dislike him by any means. It's just, of the ridiculously loaded guards in this class, I happen to have him below these other guys. The guy I have at 9 is LeBaron Philon out of Alabama, who at this point is easily, in my mind, the most underrated prospect in this draft class. He more than doubled his scoring, and he was considered a first-round pick by many, including myself, last year. He returned to school at Alabama, and the biggest concern for him was, hey, you're incredibly efficient in the paint, but you didn't shoot threes at volume and you only shot 31%. So then he returns to Alabama, more than doubles his scoring, somehow improves his scoring in the paint. He shot like 67% at the rim this season, which is wild for a 6'4" point guard. And he also shot 38% from 3 on significant volume, far more significant than the volume he put up last year when, again, he was considered a potential first-round pick. And I think the fact that all of these other guards are freshmen and he is a sophomore is a maddeningly significant part of the reason why he is not discussed in the same air as all these freshman point guards that I've discussed. But with Philon, he was a good defender this year, but he took a step back from last year when he was an elite defender. But this goes back to he was putting up 22 points a game and, being the significant portion of the Alabama offense by himself. Once he gets to the NBA, he will be able to go back to not having as insane of a usage and being the remarkable defensive player that he was in his freshman year. It's not like he forgot how to play defense. It's just that he had a lot more responsibility on the other end of the floor. So between LeBaron Philon and Braden Burries, again, even if one of those guys is in that 4 guard group that I mentioned previously or not, it doesn't matter, right? Almost by definition, 2 of the following guards will be available for the Kings wherever they pick, outside of the top 4. Because again, assuming the top 4 is chalk. 2 of Darius Acuff Jr., Kel Brown Jr., Keaton Wagler, Kingston Flemings, Braden Burries, LeBaron Philon. 2 of those guys will be on the board, guaranteed. And any of those guys are, I believe, franchise-changing guards who would be easy top half of the lottery picks in pretty much any other draft.
Likely to be a bigger contributor than Killian Hayes.
I would say so, yeah. I would put a significant amount of money on one of those 6 guards being more productive next season than Killian Hayes. Seems like one of the safest bets there is. And I don't even say that to denigrate Killian Hayes.
No. It wasn't my point, really.
No, yeah. I know it wasn't your point. Yeah. I'm just adding the extra clarification of anytime I say something that sounds absurd in the context of this guard class, I know it sounds absurd, but that's how good this guard class is. Yeah. Like, truly a significant percentage of, I genuinely believe this, that a significant percentage of the all-NBA guards for the next 20 years will come from this draft class.
Well, as bad as the Kings were this year and are as constituted right now, I would assume that adding a point guard that has that level, that magnitude of talents, will make a relatively significant difference in terms of the improvement of the team.
Yeah, and again, it's not just that these are all multi-talented guards and all of those things. It's that they all can shoot, right? It's like even even the player who has the lowest volume in terms of that. No, they're all shooting threats who will improve on the Kings being dead last in.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's that. So, Kings fans, there's something for you to be enthusiastic about, and stay tuned.
And something else to be enthusiastic about, the Kings might not be in the NBA playoffs, but certainly a few of the fan favorites from recent years are, granted, not playing playoff games in Sacramento, but they are playing playoff games elsewhere. So, Ray, this is your segment. Why don't you lead the charge for us
Well,
here?
first thing I want to say to build on what you said earlier was the point of this is not to denigrate the Kings having lost really good players or to eat bad on any of these players. It's because they were Kings players and a number of fans became attached to them in various sorts of ways and would probably want to follow what they're doing and to wish them well. And so that's the point, not any of that other point. Put that aside. We're not interested in that. So I'm just going to go down the list and ask Nick at any point to, and you don't have to comment on all of them, but any of them that you particularly would want to comment on about either how they're doing or how they did with the Kings or how they wound up where they anything that you're what you expect from them or et cetera. So certainly we could start with De'Aaron Fox.
Yeah, I mean that's the obvious choice.
Yeah, that's the obvious choice, and man, he's doing very, very well. Then our favorite player to talk about, yours and mine, I believe, Keon Ellis, and not not even 1.8%, surprisingly, how well he's been doing. Now it could change a little bit with injured players coming back and et cetera in the playoffs, and the fact that he's hasn't been there that long. But man, as soon as he arrived in Cleveland, coach said, I had no idea he was this good, right? So Keon, of course. And, we've said it, hundreds of thousands of times, how much we respected his
At
game?
least.
Okay. And anyway, he's now on a team that respects his game. So that's great. Then there's Dennis Schroeder, which I know you've talked about many times, probably don't want to talk about again, but you can if you want. It's up to you.
I mean, with Schroeder, almost the opposite of Keon in terms of value on the court versus value in terms of dollars paid to them on their NBA contract. But it's not like I dislike Schroeder by any stretch of the imagination.
No,
I'm just
not at all.
Yeah, no, it's just it didn't work out in Sacramento, and I think a lot of that was that Russell Westbrook had more left in the tank than I think either of us, or certainly it seemed like anybody involved with the Kings, believed, given that Schroeder got his contract in July and Westbrook got his in October. But sometimes these things don't work out, and this is going to sound a lot meaner than I intended to. I truly wish the man nothing but the best, but it's one of those things where, as we talked about in the immediate aftermath of the trade, better to recognize that it wasn't working halfway through year one than to just have him on the books for all 3 years. But Keon, we've talked about time and time again, and certainly him getting to be unleashed for a playoff team in Cleveland, and getting to see. It was funny because you and I pointed this out, that Cavs fans were clamoring for more Keon minutes within like 3 games of him being traded there. So, not particularly
coach, right?
Yeah. Again, not particularly surprising, but I don't think it comes as a shock to anybody here that we will always be huge Keon Ellis fans over here at the Kings Weekly Podcast.
So the next one, I think my view is that he was a very important role player when he was here. And I think he continues that. And whether that's dictated by injuries or whatever else at a particular moment, he really brings a lot that's very functional for the Lakers, and that's LaRavia.
Yeah, I mean, that was a situation where we were quite sad at the time that it seemed like he was only going to be in Sacramento for, half the season. And it played out that way. And with Arabia, I mean, his start to his Lakers career, I mean, every start anywhere else was going to be slower than his start to his Kings career.
Or
But
any player in the history of the league, yes.
yeah, no, that's just go back and listen to that episode of the Kings Weekly podcast if you forgot Laravia's first quarter of his first game in Sacramento. It was fun, and again,
he made like 6 incredible plays in the space of about a minute. Maybe I'm exaggerating slightly.
I'm not sure you are. That's the funny part. So anyway, he wasn't going to start his career anywhere else that well, but even with that caveat, it was still a slow start to the season for him with the Lakers, but certainly, given all of their injuries and also just given all the gaps he can fill as a player, it's not surprising at all that he's worked his way into a more consistent part of their rotation now that the playoffs have hit.
Absolutely. Next one would be Valanciunas, and was almost the perfect backup here in Sacramento. Has had ups and downs in Denver. I think that lately he's playing better than the little slump period that he went through. And we all know what he can do. And from the Nuggets perspective, they really better hope he has the opportunity to do it and does it, because to me, that's a very important role that he plays as the backup to Joker.
Yeah, and he's gone over in the playoffs so far, which is obviously not what you want, but certainly he is the kind of player who, in that sort of backup role to Jokic. I mean, he's not as perfect of a backup for Jokic just because Jokic can do more things than Sabonis can, but it's a very similar sort of concept of, hey, someone who can come off the bench who can keep the offense running, even if it's not, to the same level. Nobody is at the same level, so that's not a fair comparison to ask in the first place. But the idea there being very similar to what he was in Sacramento, and would have been nice for him to stick around. But on the other hand, if he stuck around, maybe we don't get Dylan Cardwell. So who knows? Maybe it all works out in the end.
Good point. So the next one is Neemias. And wow, I guess wasn't really looking for one word, but that's the one that popped into my head. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just happy for Neemias more than anything else. Like, he was really fun to watch in Sacramento. Again, didn't work out for him in the long term. I would have preferred that they had him around in the long term, but maybe he doesn't turn into the player that he's become if he remained a member of the Sacramento Kings. And I don't say that in any way to denigrate anybody working with the Kings, and more to say that, the Celtics clearly got something out of him that he wasn't as consistent with, I think it would be fair to say, during his 2 years in Sacramento. So, again, very happy for him that he's blossomed into the player that he's become. And, even from last year to this year, I mean, he's a most improved candidate in the way that I would like to think of most improved candidates, which,
whether that's a function of opportunity or a whole host of other things, is really irrelevant at this point.
Yeah.
Might have been relevant back when he was still with the Kings, but now it's irrelevant. It's like it's there, and he's shown it over and over again for the entire season.
Yeah, and, everything that I think it's more a matter of just the consistency that he's gotten. And part of that is just, consistent minutes that he wasn't getting in Sacramento. But part of that is just general overall consistency of, he had a lot of flash in the pan moments, which is why I was so excited for his Sacramento career. And the fact that he has put all of that together in the way that he has this year in Boston bodes well for him to continue to stick around the NBA for quite a long time. And that even if he, even if the vast majority of his career will be elsewhere, he did always start out as a Sacramento King. And I certainly enjoyed the brief flashes that I got to see of him in a Kings uniform. And even if he's playing for the Boston Celtics, I can't help but root for him.
So Harrison Barnes, obviously, he's at a point in his career when nobody's going to expect brilliance from him or even anywhere near the level of play when he was at his peak, but he's still a useful player. And, I'm sure they're glad to have him.
I mean, I've said before on this podcast, and I will say it again, I have never been more wrong about anything in my NBA coverage career than I was wrong about the Harrison Barnes trade. And after the first 7 games, it looked like I was, I'd made a good bet. And basically every single game after that, he, was just one of the steadiest players in the league in any manner that you could imagine steadiness, right? He played basically every game. He, started basically every game. He filled gaps. He shot threes. He played good defense up until the very end. I think that part of the reason that it seemed like it was time to move on from him in terms of, our perspective when we talked about the trade on Kings Weekly was essentially the idea of, he's not quite up to being a starting power forward in the way that he had been during the Beam Team years. And he goes to San Antonio, a team that has a lot more defensive insulation than the Kings offered. And, essentially what that meant is that he got to continue to do the things that he was exceptionally good at. And, I've talked plenty of times about how nobody ever has anything bad to say about Russell Westbrook as a teammate. Harrison Barnes, very much the same. One of those people who, when things go right for him, everybody seems to be happy. So, continuing to wish him all the best. And again, I've never been more wrong about anything than I was about the trade of him going to the Kings.
I would take exception to that only in this sense, and tell me what
you think I was more wrong about something else? Yeah, go
for
it.
No. What I do think is, though, that at least how I viewed it at the time, and you can tell me what you did, was like, he's not going to get any better than this. And his trade value can only go down from here. He should be traded before, whether the perception is accurate or not, everyone was perceiving he was on the downside of things, and get what you can for him now rather than get what you're barely going to be able to later. That was the perspective I had, and I think they did wait too long in that sense. What do you think about that?
I think they maybe waited a season too long.
Yeah.
But also, really, the majority of his fall off was, again, on the defensive side of things. And so, from the San Antonio perspective, it's like we're an incredibly young team that, for all the ridiculous talent that we have, would be nice to have some steadying forces, right? And so having Harrison Barnes on board to be much more offensively tilted versus, when he was on the Kings, it's like anybody between 6'6" and 6'10", it's either Keegan or it's Harrison Barnes. And especially in Keegan's rookie year, when he was still figuring out how to play defense, that sort of magnified the perception, I think, of Barnes's defense. And he goes to San Antonio. And again, it's like the defensive fall off is less important than the steadying presence in terms of what San Antonio needs. And he's absolutely been that steadying presence and presumably will continue to for as long as he plays NBA basketball.
Well, speaking of steadying presence, it's played in a lot lesser way, but I would still argue he is, Jordan McLaughlin. He certainly brings that anytime anybody wants to use him. And I also understand that he's been serving very well in a mentorship role. So good for him and good for them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where with McLaughlin in Sacramento, oddly enough, if he hadn't been part of the trade package to the Spurs, he probably would have had a much larger role for the Kings because, that whole no point guard thing that we talked to death at this point. But yeah, I mean, it's funny because I realized partway through, and maybe I'll surprise you with this one at the end, but realized that there's another former King who's involved in these playoffs who I know was not on your list because you didn't bring him up.
Who's that?
The veteran mentor extraordinaire Garrett Temple of the Toronto Raptors.
Well, that's kind of a good point because he's obviously doesn't play, but does serve that valuable role very valuably.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thus why I figured I'd surprise you with that one, but then you demanded that I mention it, so I really didn't have much of a choice.
Very good surprise. Kevin Huerter.
Yeah, I mean, again, it was a very weird situation transitioning from the Beam Team year to him not being in the starting lineup, and things have really gone sideways for Kevin Herter since then, and it's really unfortunate. I mean, again, one of those guys who I've never heard anyone say a negative word about as a person. So, it's one of those things where it's very easy to sort of say, oh, this guy lost it. He doesn't, whatever you might want to say about the way that his tenure in Sacramento ended. He's someone who, again, if he can just figure out how to be the special shooter that he's been for most of his life, again, I'm sure it's just absolutely impossible for him to sort of deal with just all of a sudden not being able to shoot at the level that he was.
Especially now on a team that needs shooting more than anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like, at least in theory, a good opportunity for him.
And, at least he's good enough as like a secondary playmaker type, as someone who, makes great off-ball decisions, whether his shot has abandoned him or not. There's a reason he's still getting the playing time that he is. He still moves the ball at a really high level. He's, not this crazy defender, but can be a good defensive piece in the right scheme. That didn't always work out great in Sacramento, but most defensive things haven't worked out great in Sacramento in a long time, so that's not particularly surprising. But I'm glad that, for as weird as his disappearing shot has been over the past few seasons, I'm glad that he's still playing the kind of role that he is on a really good team in Detroit, as opposed to being mired in Chicago like he was last year and the start of this year.
Yeah, so you got appropriately kind of negative remembrances of a couple of players, not as players, but as the role they played here. The next one, probably the less said about, the better in terms of his time here, because it was really ugly on a lot of different levels, and that's Buddy Hield.
Yeah, it was not a storybook ending. He does still hold the Kings record for 3-point makes, so clearly has his.
Ended, I guess, is what I'm referring to. Yes.
Yeah, this is truly not a statement about Buddy Hield in any capacity when I say that I hope that Keegan Murray breaks that record. Because it both means that Keegan is staying healthy and also that he's shooting the way that I think he can shoot and has shown pretty much every year except parts of last year as well, I guess. Either way, if Keegan sticks around in a Kings uniform and shoots the way that I hope he can and continue to, he'll probably pass that up. But, for a Kings record holder, it is weird how toxic and dark everything got around the end of Buddy Hield's tenure in Sacramento. He's moved to a few different spots since then, but he still holds a Kings record, and wishing him the best, even though it was not a pretty ending in Sacramento.
No, and it was pretty ugly on both sides.
Yeah.
The thing about Keegan, though, I think if he were able to get his shooting up to that level and get to the line, which Buddy never did.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, unfortunately, Keegan doesn't either, which is
not to the extent. I could be wrong in the statistics, but I thought it's not anywhere near as bad as what Buddy. But is that wrong?
It's close. Like, yeah,
I stand corrected. Okay.
It was much better.
Get to the line.
It was much better this year than it had been in years past, but last year he played more game. Like, he had less than a free throw attempt a game last year.
Okay.
So
I see the potential there.
Yeah, but
we'll see.
We will certainly see. Keegan's already, he's almost halfway there already. So if he plays out his contract and is healthy and shoots like he did most years of his career, this year not included, he's got a good shot. I like his chances.
And the last player on the list, and again, my observation would be, I don't know how he could be in a more perfect spot for him than Dante DiVincenzo. And he's playing it really, really well.
Yeah, it was a weird half year in Sacramento for Dante. I had much higher hopes for him sticking around and being a part of the Kings going forward. But what we're seeing from him in Minnesota is a lot of what he's done. Not to put too fine a point on it, but basically every stop other than Sacramento in his career, right? Of being this 38+% shooter who also you can have offense run through him at times, who also plays hard-nosed defense, who just fills a lot of gaps for a team. And again, unfortunate for multiple reasons that basically outside of his rookie year, the 1 year he didn't check all those boxes was his half season in Sacramento, but he's a really, really valuable rotation piece, and he's got a good thing going in Minnesota.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's the list. I think they're very interesting to follow, and everybody's got their own reasons to want to follow them.
Yeah. I mean, Keon and Nemish will be two of my favorite NBA players until the day they hang them up. So I will always be rooting for them in whatever stop they end up. So, if one of the other players on the list that we mentioned is that guy for you, then we're glad to have mentioned him. And if that guy was Garrett Temple, you're really in the weeds with Kings fandom, and we salute you deeply.
I think Keon is the favorite player of virtually everyone who follows the NBA, save two people.
Gosh, I wonder who those two might be. Oh, wait.
I don't know.
No, I don't. No, I don't wonder who those two might be.
I don't want to know, but I do know, unfortunately.
We all are aware, unfortunately, for all of us. So, as teased up top, before we wrap things up, we're going back to the well with another song title to describe the Kings season. So, Ray, you had a pick. You're the one that inspired us to do it this time around. So
this is my description of the Kings season, and as everybody knows, I've been on a Elvis Costello roll for a while, so I'm going to stay there. Although this song originally was done by Sam and Dave, maybe the more known version was by Elvis Costello, and I think this sums up the Kings season quite well. Can't stand up for falling down.
I had a similar one that I think is not just the Kings this year, but really the Kings since 2005, because the song came out in the mid 2000s, but specifically in 2009, aka after 2002. So it's the titular album song for Green Day's album 21st Century Breakdown. That is the Sacramento Kings. Just
that is, and again, we're talking about song titles, not necessarily the lyrics to the song.
Yeah, well, again, it's both the album title and the song title, and quite frankly, outside of the first couple of years of the century, it's been a century-long breakdown for the Sacramento Kings. All right.
So, I think that wraps up our show for today.
That it does. I was just about to go into my little wrap-up spiel.
Okay. Go ahead.
So here we are. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's episode. As mentioned up top, we are part of the Basketball Intelligence Network, which you can find on social media at Ticket Rules, and you can find on basketballintelligence.net, as previously mentioned. We are also part of the Believe Network, which you can find on social media at BLEAV. We're also part of the Old Man Squad Network, which you can find at Old Man Squad. And you can find us at Kings Weekly Pod on Twitter, at Kings Weekly Podcast on Blue Sky. If you've been enjoying the show, please be sure to subscribe in whatever podcast player you might be using. Rating and review, also much appreciated. 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. Always love to see those. And if you're checking us out on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video as well. And finally, if you have any feedback regarding the show, feel free to reach out to us either via the aforementioned social media channels or email kingsweeklypodcast@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, everyone.